Sony's PlayStation 5 is scheduled to launch next year, Christmas, which is roughly the same time window as Microsoft's Xbox Scarlet. But there is a report from a respected Japanese journalist, Zenji Nishikawa, that Sony will be handling the launch of the PS5 very differently to what they did with the PS4. Instead of just launching a base system and then several years later following up with a Pro, Zenji insists that we will see the PS5 and the PlayStation 5 Pro launch simultaneously next holiday season. The purpose of this video is not just to analyse what Zenji Nishikawa has told us, but to also look back at the last 12 months or so of PlayStation 5 leaks. Some of these leaks are almost 12 months old, but rather fascinatingly, they do seem to have an awful lot of detail in them that has not been officially released until several months later, but they also hold a few other nuggets as well, so we'll be going through all of that. We're going to keep the technical discussion to a lower amount than normal. The simple reason is that this video is already going to be quite lengthy, and the purpose here is to just get a sense of where we are with the PlayStation 5 specifications, as well as what we can possibly expect if we do see a PS5 Pro along with the base model. I'll be putting out a second video soon which will be going deeper into the technical specifications of the system and how they differ compared to the PS4. You can also find this as a written article, which of course is linked in the description of this very video. It's first important for us to get a caveat out of the way. The information that Zenji received is from the CDEC event, where he was speaking to developers who told him that Sony understood that there was a demand for a pro version of the console, and the company were now aiming to launch the PS5 and PS5 Pro simultaneously. Zenji Nishikawa has been accurate with previous leaks, including the fact that we would get several new Switch variants, and is well regarded in the industry. But with that said, any information can be wrong, company plans can certainly change, and most of this information is from a live stream. And this starts at 29 minutes in. I'll link it of course in the description of this very video. Also, he has not provided any specifications of either the PS5 Pro or the PS5 Vanilla, or exactly what Sony are attempting to achieve with a quote Pro version of the machine. So it is possible that Pro isn't necessarily a specification bump, so for example a faster CPU, but instead other differences more reflecting what we saw with the launch of the PS3. If you recall, the PS3 shipped with, say, different hard drive sizes, and given the PS5 will be coming with a very fast SSD, it looks like it's going to essentially be a PCIe Gen 4 drive, given what we've learned from Sony. A potential is that the Pro model would simply come with a larger drive, or potentially with a secondary drive to boot, and maybe some different accessories, such as, say, a bundled headset, for online use or other peripherals, but we'll discuss this later on. Microsoft are also working on a couple of different consoles, Lockhart as well as Anaconda. Phil Spencer did mention that Microsoft were working on a few Xbox consoles simultaneously during E3 2018, but then there were reports that Lockhart was dead. Later we had reports that Xbox Lockhart wasn't dead, instead it was designed as a, quote, streaming-only console, and most of the processing was handled on xCloud, which is Microsoft's game streaming service, and local processing was relegated to basic game logic, network stuff as well, which should, in theory, reduce latency compared to, say, how Google Stadia works, as that doesn't really process any data locally at all, at least for the game. Xbox Anaconda is the most powerful console from Microsoft, from what we know anyway, and from the little we do know about it, at least officially, it's based on a second-gen AMD Navi architecture with hardware ray tracing, a custom Zen 2 CPU, and lots of memory. Oh, and a super fast SSD as well. That's about 40 times faster than the Xbox One X. So, if you listen to all of that and think that Sony and Microsoft have a very similar sounding set of specifications, you'd not be too wrong. The fact of the matter is, when you give teams of engineers a set of criteria, very frequently they're going to come to the same conclusions. After all, think about it. Both Sony and Microsoft have to work with AMD's roadmap. Both Sony and Microsoft have a set price point. After all, they can't charge $800 for a console, for example. They also have roughly the same target release date, Christmas season 2020. We may see one console launch, let's say the 1st of November, and another system launch, let's say the 15th of December, but realistically, 5-6 weeks is not going to make much of a difference for product roadmaps. So, there are, however, differences on the console when it comes to the execution. How much of a loss, if any, the console manufacturer chooses to take with the system, what they decide to do in terms of the clock frequencies of the CPU and GPU, as well as the configuration of the GPU, such as how many cores it has, what customizations they add into the hardware, the amount of memory and the speed that it runs at, and so on, will all make for different configurations of a console. Sony, for their part, has confirmed an 8-core CPU based on the Zen 2 architecture in a wired interview with Mark Cerny, and an RDNA-based AMD GPU. Performance targets were not mentioned, and the amount of system memory and other specifications were also absent. But there were a few hints as to what might be inside the machine, thanks to a couple of other leaks which likely give us some idea of what Sony are working on. Tim Apisak, a well-known leaker, has found an APU which is possibly the PlayStation 5's APU. While it does seem a good fit for the PS5's APU, Gonzalo does have a few things which seem a little odd, mostly the GPU generation, which we'll get into. Gonzalo has been spotted a few times. The first time was likely an early production model, as it was listed as ES Engineering Sample, which had lower clock speeds for the GPU and a few other differences. The image you're seeing here may look gibberish, but it does provide you all you need to know if you know what you're looking for. It's a Zen 2 based CPU inside with 8 processor cores. It's a gaming platform, so that would be console. It's an ES, Engineering Sample, has 1600 MHz for the base CPU frequency and 3200 MHz for the turbo frequency. There's also a base and boost speed for the GPU, although both on 1 GHz. Then there was a later leak, also discovered by Tim Apisak, also AMD Gonzalo. This was a few months later. The APU is now a qualification sample. Basically, this means that we're closer to the final production silicon, and it no longer has any glaring flaws, such as, say, crashing frequently. The GPU clock is now running at 1800 MHz, but the CPU speeds are the same as I just mentioned. Consoles do not have base and boost speeds like the PC, but instead will operate at the same frequencies unless there's a major heat issue, such as blocked air vents, and then the parts will automatically downclock. The point of a console is to maintain the same performance so developers can easily develop games for it, so the base and boost speeds here are likely related to the PS5's backwards compatibility mode. Indeed, we've seen quite the number of backwards compatibility patents filed by Sony, and I've gone rather in depth with them in the past on the channel, but there have also been a few other interesting developments. There have been a number of questions regarding the generation of Navi. The first generation Navi GPU does not support any form of hardware ray tracing, while the second generation, which is due out for next year, does. It's possible that the PlayStation 5 GPU is based on the first generation of Navi, but still a custom design with elements of the second generation. Sony did this with the PS4 Pro, for example, which was mostly Polaris based but had some elements of the later Vega architecture. But whether Sony is doing the same thing here with the PS5 and using the first generation of Navi with some elements of the second generation, for example for ray tracing, isn't 100% clear. During AMD's E3 2019 press conference, Lisa Su went on stage and said the following about both companies and their upcoming next generation consoles.
Sony announced that the next-gen PlayStation would be built around AMD's new gaming architectures, and we've been working collaboratively with Sony over the last few years to build a custom chip based on the Zen 2 and the next-gen Radeon architectures. And we are incredibly excited to partner with Sony to enable their vision of the next-generation console. Now, but what you heard from Phil Spencer and the Microsoft team is they announced the next amazing chapter in our partnership, the next-generation Xbox, codenamed Project Scarlet. Now, Project Scarlet is powered by a custom processor co-engineered between our team and the Microsoft team with one goal in mind: to deliver the ultimate gaming experience. And it uses our Zen 2 CPU core and our next-generation Radeon RDNA gaming graphics architecture, and we're absolutely thrilled.
I actually asked an AMD employee about this and was told that this was likely agreed upon by the partner, i.e. Sony and Microsoft would give the okay on what Lisa could say on stage. So potentially it means that there is no difference in the generation of GPU in both consoles, but it also potentially means that there is. The source of contention here is that this was prior to the launch of the Nave cards for PC. So technically, when Lisa said next generation Radeon graphics in relation to the PlayStation 5, that could mean the first generation of Nave, because at the time that would be the next generation of Radeon cards. The phrasing for the Xbox, though, is more ambiguous, because you could take it to mean the second generation of Nave cards, which will launch next year with hardware ray tracing as an inherent feature. Lisa did confirm, though, that both companies were using custom GPUs, so the generation may be much less meaningful compared to what you would see on a PC anyway. So given the PS5 has hardware ray tracing, based upon what Sony have said, we know that at least some elements of the second generation Nave architecture are present. The question is, though, is it based upon the second generation with customization, or instead is the GPU in the PS5 based on the first generation with additional features of the second generation? So more similar to how the PS4 Pro was based on the Polaris architecture from AMD, but with Vega features added.
With that in mind, we more than doubled the power of the GPU and adopted many new features from the AMD Polaris architecture, as well as several even beyond it.
And also, the other key question, what's the difference between the PS5 GPU architecture versus the Xbox Scarlets? There was also a paste bin leak. Well, there was a couple, but let's start with the first one. Haha. A supposed set of specifications for the PS5 was leaked, and it said that the development kit had 32GB of memory, but the retail console would have just 24GB of memory. This leak also mentioned 6GB of DDR4 memory. Supposedly this was for both operating system as well as an SSD cache. But the other thing that was very interesting was a mention of a 70 amp 16-stage VRM design. Out of the two pastebin leaks we're discussing, I feel that this is definitely the least likely of the two in terms of potentially being accurate, although you must remember that development kits, generally speaking, are way bigger and more power hungry compared to retail systems. And there are also a couple of other leaks which may add some credibility here. The first of which is a leak concerning the aesthetics of the machine, where we can see quite beefy cooling, and the second is potentially a leak concerning the GPU clock frequencies, which are actually really high for a console. In the aesthetics, we can see a Sony PlayStation 5 design pattern, and you can see just from the illustration how much room there is for cooling. It's very different from what you would expect from a traditional PS5 design, and there's a very good reason for it. There was a tweet from developer Matthew Stott. This tweet has since been deleted, although you can still find remnants of it on the internet using the normal methods of Google Cache and so on. And in this tweet, Matthew said that it was a development kit, but also it may even be the console itself. and there were other reports which said that this is the final PS5 design. Now this is joined with another leak which happened at roughly the same time period, and this leak is from Kamichi, who is very well known on Twitter. He found a GPU which was Oberon A0, and there were 3 gens here, each of which had a graphics clock, 800 MHz, 911 MHz, and finally 2 GHz. Kamichi and I regularly speak on Twitter, particularly when I had a lot of Ryzen 3000 information before others, because I got some exclusive information for that, as well as Nave, so he and I were exchanging bits of information back then, and I did ask him regarding Oberon. What you can see is Gen 0 would represent PS4 vanilla, so the base system's backwards compatibility mode. Gen 1 is essentially the clock frequency of the PS4 Pro, and Gen 2 would be PS5. We've learned quite a lot from backwards compatibility patents in the past, and that's one of the reasons I'm glazing over this, because I don't want this video to be even longer. You can check out my videos on the backwards compatibility mode if you would so desire, but the gist is that when a PS4 game would load on the PS5, from what we understand from the patents, components on the chip would essentially be closed down, clock frequencies would be reduced. So for example, you would have fewer GPU cores, you would have certain features of that GPU disabled, so it's better able to emulate the base PS4 hardware. This is to make sure that the software runs identically compared to the PS4. Because obviously, you don't want the frame rates to be different, game logic to be affected, or it to crash, and so on and so on. Just so that we're super duper clear, the APU is Gonzalo. So the APU contains the CPU, it contains the GPU, it contains the memory controllers, plus whatever other bits and bobs, whereas Oberon is the GPU, the graphics processing unit. So only the bits and bobs which are required to produce the graphics on the system. But notice once again how much cooling the system would have based upon the design that we've seen leak. There's lots of space for cooling, lots of space for a vapor chamber, a little bit like the Xbox One X, and how Microsoft opted to cool the Xbox One X's APU, which was known as the Scorpio engine. I bring this up because upon further reflection, it may add a bit more credibility to the pastebin leak and the insane 16-phase VRM design. Because if a console really does have such high power APU, as well as power requirements, it would only require a hefty cooler, as seen in these leaks, but also lots of power to be fed to it, the 16-phase design. There is, however, one piece of evidence which indicates that the next generation PlayStation is designed with lower power operation in mind. Jim Ryan, who is the head of Sony Interactive, was recently speaking via the company's blog on climate change and power consumption. I'm going to read this out verbatim. At SIE, we have made substantial commitments and efforts to reduce power consumption on the PS4 by utilizing efficient technologies such as system-on-chip architecture integrating high-performance graphics processor, die shrinking, power scaling, as well as energy-saving modes such as suspend to RAM. For context, we estimate the carbon emissions avoided to date are almost 16 million metric tons, increasing to 29 million metric tons over the course of the next 10 years, which equals the CO2 emissions of the nation of Denmark in 2017. Right there, that paragraph is definitely related to the PS4 only. So they're referring to the APU in there, the die shrinks that we've seen for different iterations of the PS4. Remember, the slimlined do use a smaller die process, and so on and so on. So all of that is definitely related to the PS4. But then he goes on to mention about the PS5. I'm also very pleased to announce that the next generation PlayStation console will include the possibility to suspend gameplay with much lower power consumption than the PS4. We estimate this can be achieved at around 0.5 watts. If just 1 million users enable this feature, it would save the equivalent to the average electricity use of 1,000 US homes. The blog also added, and I quote, "From an operations point of view, we will complete a carbon footprint assessment of our gaming services, and will report the energy efficiency measures we employ in our data centers. We are committed to informing consumers of energy efficient console setup and use." End quote. So, let's just be honest here. If a retail console did suck down 300 watts of power, just for the sake of argument, this would be not really in line with what has just been said here by Jim. To put it in context, the PS4 requires around 150 to 200 watts. This does heavily depend upon the game that's being played, what the model is. Remember, there has been multiple models of the PS4, and I don't just mean PS4 release system, the Slim as well as Pro. There are iterations of the PS4, and each one does require slightly different power. And obviously, if you're playing a game which isn't super demanding, it's going to require a lot less power than something like God of War. And also, other applications such as, say, playing a movie via a Blu-ray or streaming via Netflix will also have different power consumption as well. So I'm talking worst case scenario, 150 to 200 watts. Even if you say that the retail console, the PS5, goes up to 250 watts, is that really in line with what Sony are saying? But there's a very interesting pastebin leak, a second pastebin leak to be clear, which was dated back in December 2018. And a lot of people have forgotten about this leak now. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. But it does have some very interesting information. I'm going to plop it on screen so you can read alongside with me. And I'm going to read it verbatim, although obviously any spelling and grammar problems are down to the op. PS5 official info from Sony somewhere around next E3. So Sony will not participate on E3. I'd say Q2 2019 small reveal. PS5 release in March 2020 or November 2020, not finalised. Backwards compatibility, physical games and PS Store, PS Plus and PS Plus Premium. Specs, CPU, 7nm Ryzen 8-core 16 threads, unknown speed, 7nm Navi architecture, around 14 T-flops. It's going to be powerful and power efficient, Sony working with AMD for Navi, some sort of ray tracing but won't focus on it. More focus with VR and 4K, much better bandwidth overall. 24GB of GDDR6, plus 4GB DDR4 for the OS. We have 32GB development kits, 2GB HDD, some sort of NAND flash, 8K upscaling, PS VR2 in 2020, also big reveal with PS5, big resolution boost, probably 1440p, 120Hz or 220 FOV, eye tracking, wireless, battery life around 4 or 5 hours, hood phones, integrated, less motion sickness, no breaker box, much less cable management, focus on VR for AAA games, price around $250. DualShock 5, some sort of camera inside the VR. Some sort of camera for VR. More analog precision for FPS. Something similar to Steam analog trackpad. The price of the console is around $500 and $100 loss per console at the beginning. End quote. There are definitely a couple of things which aren't 100% lining up. One of them is the GPU T-flops, because even if we say that it has the same number of compute units as the RX 5700 XT and number of shaders as well, which is 2560, assuming the 2 GHz GPU rumour is accurate, you get around 10 T-flops of GPU performance, around 10.2 G-flops of GPU performance. But you could also say that you can make that 14 T-flop not technically in terms of raw floating point performance, but in terms of efficiency, because RDNA is way more efficient of an architecture compared to Vega or Polaris. So technically speaking, 14 teraflops isn't accurate. But if you take efficiency into account, it does become an equivalent of around 14 teraflops. I am keeping this simpler because I don't want this to be a super technical video, but essentially that's what it is. I will do a much deeper analysis into that, but you can also do an analysis, you can do a bit of research yourself by looking at Nave versus Vega, and of course you can see what's on screen yourself as well. But there are definitely quite a few things here which were accurate. Remember, this dated back 2018 in December, so several things definitely do line up. The RDNA, Nave plus the Zen CPU do line up, although you can argue that if you had access to the knowledge that AMD were providing the base hardware for the PS5, what else would it be, right? You can certainly make that logical argument, and I would be 100% behind you on that. But what is accurate, which was not known at the time, first of all, the PS VR2, which had eye tracking. It was wireless. The battery life was around 5 hours. Integrated headphone, and so on and so on. All of that has basically been confirmed via several patents that have emerged. Furthermore, the DualShock 5 having a camera for VR also appears to have been confirmed by some leaked patents. Backwards compatible is confirmed, although once again there was enough information to say that you could guess that. Physical games as well as PS Store, you could certainly guess that as well. The PS5 official information from Sony, basically kind of a small reveal, that was also quite accurate. So I'm not saying that this information is right, because at the end of the day, it could just be really good guesswork. And I'm not here to sell you that this leak or any other leak is real, because you should only believe something 100% when Sony confirms it. But I would say that it's either a really good guess, or it was an early leak, but obviously some specifications can change, so potentially the GPU is going to be a bit different to what was said here. It's going to be quite interesting. So the question is then, is a PlayStation 5 Pro coming at launch, or will it just be the base system? Well, what's about to follow is purely speculation on my part, and this is not insider information outside of what we've already discussed in this video. So please take it as my opinion and not some insider information or leak. So theory 1 is when the PS5 was demoed to investors, Sony showed a graphic, and it speaks for itself. It's revolving around game streaming. I think most people here are familiar with PlayStation Now, which is Sony's own official game streaming service, so I'm not going to go too deep into what that is. But it's possible that the Pro version of the PS5 is basically just the vanilla machine that we've been hearing about. But Sony are doing what Microsoft is supposedly doing with Lockhart, developing a PlayStation designed purely for streaming. You pair a PS5 controller, and it features a highly cut down APU, just enough grunt to run the operating system, maybe a little bit of local processing. In short, Sony would be creating a new, low power, low cost, entry level system for people who do not want to plonk down, let's say $500 on a PS5. This would also match what Zenji said about hearing people wanting more choice. But instead of a more powerful, expensive system, this would basically flip that on its head, and instead be a cheaper entry-level device. Given this is a translation, and what he heard at an expo, I don't think that's out of the realms of possibility. Theory 2. Sony are going to launch 2 variants, but the second variant is just with more SSD space, comes with additional peripherals such as a headset, perhaps with a slightly different case design, let's say like the Xbox 360 Premium versus the Arcade, maybe a few other bits and pieces. So basically what I said close to the start of this video. And theory 3, and the most interesting, is the PS5 would have a more powerful, faster variant of hardware which we can call Pro, compared to the base PS5. This would be very curious because supposedly Microsoft were planning a low-end SKU for the Xbox which would be kind of like the Xbox One S as well as Xbox One X. The rumours here are a bit mixed, some saying the original Lockhart was this system, but then was repurposed into a streaming-only console. Others have said that Lockhart and the streaming system, as well as the most powerful system, Anaconda, were all separate, so there were 3 systems, but the lower end system got scrapped and now we only have Anaconda, which is the premium system, as well as a streaming console. Who knows which of those is accurate? But the rumours are that developers whispered to Microsoft that this would eat up too much of their development time, particularly at the start of a new console generation. Because obviously at the start of a new console generation, developers are attempting to figure out what hardware even does, how to develop for it, the tools for it, and so on and so on. And thus, one version, or probably even both, would suffer on the Xbox hardware. Basically, developers would just say, that's good enough for the Anaconda, and that's good enough for, let's say, Lockhart. Neither runs the best, but it does the job. We don't have enough time to put in this amount of engineering resources into a system that we barely understand. So if Sony are planning this, it'll be interesting how they get around that problem. Furthermore, assuming that the APU that we've seen, a Gonzalo, has been accurate to the base PS5, that means there's another PS5 APU that we've not seen yet, unless Oberon, the GPU, is part of this unknown APU, and there's no evidence of this, which I guess would explain why it's clocked at 2 GHz versus the 1800 MHz of Gonzalo, but we also would expect there be a lot of additional GPU cores as well, as, let's face it, 1800 MHz to 2 GHz, that's not really going to be enough to make any real difference for games. This also begs the question, what will happen 2 to 3 years after the PS5 and Xbox Scarlet launch, let's say holiday 2023? We can assume there will be some sort of refresh planned, because, well, Microsoft have confirmed that that's the plan, and Sony have hinted it, but it's hard to imagine that users won't be frustrated, coughing up for a Pro machine, and then a, Super Pro comes out? How would they even market that? The PS5 is said to be capable of 8K output, but it's been somewhat clarified that this is for upscaling and games will render generally at 4K. 8K, don't forget, is literally 4 times the number of pixels compared to 4K. A leaked benchmark of the PS5 Gonzalo APU has said that it scores roughly 4 times that of the PS4 base model for 3D Mark Firestrike, putting it roughly on par with a GeForce RTX 2070. And even an RTX 2080 Ti, which is massively faster than the RTX 2070, is only just about capable of 4K gaming. Granted though, the Gonzalo APU in this benchmark was not optimized, and it's possible that with some tweaking we would get additional performance out of it. The bottom line here is that Sony, in theory, could make a more powerful APU than what we know about for the base model console and cram in additional GPU cores at higher speeds, but I suspect that the CPU cores will remain at 8, potentially with higher clock frequencies. Assuming we do see an APU, and AMD seem to have confirmed this at E3, even with such a potentially beefy cooling system as was seen in these patents, there are limits to what you can achieve with a console. I just don't think we're going to get as big of a gap if we see a simultaneous launch of the PS5 and PS5 Pro as we saw with the PS4 and PS4 Pro, or even the Xbox One and the Xbox One X. The biggest problem here is that the APU is already likely to be pretty big for a PS5 GPU that's roughly on par with an RX 5700 XT, which, if the Gonzalo leaks and other benchmarks we've seen are accurate, that's roughly what we'd be seeing in terms of GPU size. The Nabe 10 die is 251 mm². Then we need to add 8 Zen 2 CPU cores, which we know come in at around 74 mm² for the desktop processor. 8 CPU cores come together to form a single die, a chiplet, though much of this area is taken up by level 3 cache. I personally have made the prediction that we'll see this halved to only 16 megabytes of level 3 cache versus the 32 megabytes of level 3 cache that we see in, say, the desktop. This would save a significant amount of die space, and I don't think it's going to have that much of an impact in gaming performance. I have actually discussed this much deeper in my Xbox Scarlet E3 analysis, and also have gone much deeper into the Zen 2 architecture in a video known as All You Need to Know About Zen 2. I'll try to remember to link them in the video description, but you can also search for them, of course, on the channel. We would also need some form of I/O controller for communicating with memory, input devices, and so on, and potentially some other space if we have some type of dedicated ray tracing technology, depending on how that's implemented. We've seen patents from AMD with some type of hybrid ray tracing, but even so, potentially that still would require additional die space. In theory then, 8 Zen 2 CPU cores, a Navi 10 based GPU and other bits which would be needed in the silicon just for the system to function, and we would likely be at a similar size in APU to the Xbox One X, known as the Scorpio engine. The question here is whether we would see the use of TSMC's 7nm Plus process instead of the 7nm process currently used in Zen 2 and Navi 10. This would improve density and reduce power consumption a little more, around 10 to 15%. With such a large APU, it'll be fascinating to see what would a higher spec Pro machine at launch would even look like. Game streaming becoming the norm in the next generation, plus of course next generation consoles as well, hardware ray tracing becoming standard with next generation GPUs, Intel getting in on the GPU game for the PC, 4K TVs becoming actually pretty damn affordable right now, plus lots of other stuff over the next 12 to 24 months. I suspect that the next generation of consoles as well as gaming is going to be absolutely fascinating. And I hope that you will subscribe to the channel as well as follow us on social media to continue our journey into the next generation. But you can also find us, of course, on social media, which you can find linked below. And with all of that said, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.